Okay.
Hi, my name is June from Pair Up Side by Side, and I just wanted to join y'all today to talk about brain health. And I have my friend here recording with me, and I'm gonna let him introduce himself.
Okay. All right. So my name's Max Stager. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I work with folks on relationships and mental health issues. That's my primary area. And then I also do advocacy and activism, change making around prison issues is kind of where I'm headed. And that's kind of where you and I, June, got together. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think my podcast, I'm going to call it Outside the Fence, Doing Time Outside the Fence. So, yeah. So, but yeah, we're here to talk about brain health today,
Yeah.
which is a big issue for lots of folks. Lots of people in prison have had traumas and head traumas and things like that too. So, yeah.
And a lot of people outside of the prison system as
That's
well.
yeah, that's what I was saying. Inside and outside. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's an important thing that we understand
I've
the
had head
importance.
injuries before, so
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, it's important for us to understand that the holistic health of a human and the health of our brain is really important, and that there's a lot of people struggling with different issues because of different reasons. Sometimes it's chemical imbalances, sometimes it's, head injuries, or it could be adverse childhood experiences and all, or it could be traumas in adulthood as well. So there are different ways that people find their brain health might be affected. But there are definitely a lot of
Many
options for
factors.
treatment.
Yeah, many factors. There's a genetic component that kind of predisposes some of us to certain things like addictions and ADHD and even PTSD. So there's things that can predispose us, and then our environment can make us susceptible, and then what happens, and then traumatic events. So it's very complex how, yeah, brain health and mental health are, yeah. And looking at it from a holistic point of view. Hopefully I didn't interrupt you.
Oh no,
So, yeah,
I'm a talker. We both like to talk. No, I
yeah.
love that. We're both very expressive humans, and I really like that about both of us. I think
Me? I
we're
talk? Really? Oh.
you listen a lot and you
I
talk a
do.
lot.
I can talk a lot too. Yes. Uh-huh.
Um, so one
So
thing,
you had some things happen today. Is that what you wanted to talk about?
yeah, so I had a few things happen today. But backtracking before I forget, you were saying that there are a lot of different factors that affect people's brain health, and a lot of factors. I wanted to speak about something that science has been saying a lot lately, like a lot of
Hmm.
neuroscientists and psychologists and mental health workers, that trauma is imprinted in DNA.
Yeah, I was
And
just thinking that when you said it, because
yeah,
people from the Holocaust,
hmm
the children of survivors of the Holocaust are more likely to have PTSD than other folks who did not encounter that kind of traumatic event. So how did people who did not go through the Holocaust, but their parents or grandparents did, they have shown, I don't know I know I have seen that research, but yeah, there are risks then for that kind of thing or other kinds of traumatic events. It's not
yeah,
just,
because the Holocaust is that's a very traumatic experience that hits a lot of different of the human basic needs that were not being met,
mm-hmm,
and the trauma and all the death and all the fear and high cortisol rates. So that's like those are Holocaust survivors, and their
mm-hmm.
children have been impacted by this, and even like the grandchildren probably as well, because it's
Yeah,
but the Holocaust seems like a really big, huge extreme. I don't think that we have to go that extreme. I think just,
that's just the
trauma in
research I knew
general,
about.
like
Yeah.
domestic violence in the home,
Mm-hmm.
um, child abuse survivors. I think that
Hmm.
it would be interesting to see
There's
how this
generational.
affects people genetically, even.
Yeah.
I don't think you have to be a Holocaust survivor. I think just,
No, that one was just an obvious,
yeah,
very clear, the research. I mean, you could tell, I mean, like you knew this thing happened. Um, and it wasn't in, it was like a big group of people that it happened to. So the sample was probably larger.
mm,
Yeah, and I'm sure it happens with people with domestic violence, childhood abuses of various kinds. Of course it can.
mhm,
Because when I work with clients, I go, sometimes we're doing it better than our parents and then that better than their parents, but, sometimes worse, but we're not doing as well. But those things can be passed on. You can see that. Some of it could be modeling that happens, but the impact on the child, and that combined with the genetic piece could make it more likely. Then you live it again, and then it's more likely to show up
mhm.
because it becomes part of who they are. Because a lot of people go, well, that's how I was raised. And they'll say, that's why I act like whatever in a certain way. So, yeah.
Yeah. Um, that's interesting. Today I went to a chiropractor that also does neurological work,
Hmm.
and I had some neurological assessments done and also I believe, EEG scan of my brain. So
Hmm.
they had multiple
Sensors.
sensors on different parts of my brain, including my earlobe, and it was reading the different types of wavelengths, like he specified what different types of wavelengths it was reading.
Hmm.
And some of it seemed really, really active. Like
Hmm.
it seems like I'm really high in the cortisol state.
Hmm.
And then others seems really sluggish. I haven't gotten the results yet, like explained to me yet. That appointment's happening next Monday, but it's rather interesting because I have noticed as a child growing up, there were a lot of areas that I struggled with my learning and my sensorial, like I had sensorial issues, developmental issues, learning challenges, social emotional regulation challenges, even motor skill challenges. That
Hmm.
thankfully, because of being in physical movement my whole life and being a reader and a writer and talking about my feelings, I've actually noticed that I can check off less things of that neurological assessment. I find that I've helped my brain rewire various parts of itself to help form new neuropaths. And I was wondering your feedback from a professional perspective of what I just explained.
Oh, well, yeah. If you had a stressful events or you had some genetic influences, it's very possible, yeah, that your brain was wired differently. And then depending on what was going on when you're little, there's a piece of that that can affect the development because we have reflexes, and it shows up in the pons and the midbrain, and it affects how we develop. And then your brain accommodates that. Nobody is like totally fulfilling. I mean, stuff happens. No parent can meet all the needs, but of a child, they can create. They can meet many of them. So, but some parents may not be able to do that, especially if they're stressed out, right? And so that could have affected how you started very early, even in utero, because your responses, your brain was being formed and being impacted. And then we start developing eventually thoughts, but they're more of intrinsic memory versus extrinsic. That means we just kind of sense it, like you just know how it feels, or you don't. And that could be like some of those things that you just couldn't do early on because they got impacted instead of being able to develop those parts of yourself when you're little. So I don't know if that totally explains. I don't know. It depends on what part of the brain they're looking at.
They were
and
looking
how
at my
those,
whole brain. They were
well,
looking
it
at
depends on where they
various.
show up, where it shows up at, because
Oh,
those will be associated with different kinds of issues because different parts of our brain do different things. Like in trauma, one of the things, the research, it's a little old now, but the right side of the brain would hold it like up here in brain scans, except so that created a problem because it's not as verbal, so it's more of a sensed kind of thing, and it makes it harder for it to go away, like to for it just like it's you don't have the words sometimes for it.
hmm.
So our brain, the brain functions of different parts of our brain, prefrontal cortex making decisions and things like that. But we have deeper senses underneath subcortical. A lot of our feelings are underneath that. They may interact. Most of them will be just part of how we, like how we're moving, sadness, things like that are subcortical. Before we're like even thinking about it, something's happening, and then we start to feel a certain way. Some things are related to us thinking it through, like guilt, shame. That will be connected to like we have these thoughts up here. But it also guides our decisions up here. That's where it gets it for addicted folks. That's where it can be impacted because their decisions and their values get changed by the substance if it's a substance. So they actually are thinking differently, and their brain would show those kind of patterns.
One thing I thought was really interesting about my visit today, was that he was performing various like neurological assessments on me, like having me physically
Hmm.
do things, and he was observing how my body was reacting, including my balance.
Hmm.
It was rather interesting that I don't know what is this part of the brain.
There's a pons, a cerebellum, but balance, I think, is in the cerebellum. And so that's back here. I had a brain scan in late 2022 and I got it. And I mean, I couldn't really read the MRI, but I could see it. But I knew it was a cerebellum because it looked like a bunch of trees when it went through that part of my brain
Is
back
that
there.
part of the brain responsible for emotional regulation, digestion,
Some
and
of those, yeah, some
appetite, and also sleep?
sleep, some of the autonomic things. Yeah. And then you
Yes.
have
So
some of the, yeah, and they get influenced by other parts of the brain and brain chemistry.
yeah, so
Yeah.
that apparently seems to be one of the weaker part of my brains, and it seems that I am
Hmm.
very immature in the development of this part of my brain, and that's why I've suffered with insomnia since I was a child, and struggle with appetite, and like
Hmm.
weight management, and even like regulating my heart rate and my breathing,
Hmm.
things that are autonomous, I have
Yeah.
just struggled with forever. And it shows up as, insomnia and, lack of appetite
Hmm.
and uh, rapid heart rate and leading to
Hmm.
anxiety. So it made a lot of sense. I like when he did that thing, and based off of my results, he's like, you're very immature in the
I
development
would use the
area,
word
like
less
severely
developed.
immature.
Yeah. Like immature sometimes sounds like it was a choice, but I would say less developed. It just didn't have, and it probably didn't have the opportunity to develop
I
for
don't
various
I
reasons.
think it was stemming even from my development in utero, plus
Hmm.
my early childhood experiences.
Sure.
It all kind of adds up because I come from a mother who went through a traumatic childhood and
Yeah.
distressing events as an adult. And then she became pregnant with me, and I think in utero, there was a lot of things that she hadn't processed, that was affecting
Mm.
her mental health. And then I became born,
Hmm.
and, maternal depression and
Yeah.
all of that, and mental health,
One out of
you
six
know,
women have postpartum depression.
yeah.
That's a lot of women. And when they do, like there's like sometimes I show my clients, uh, They're kind of really sad interactions, but a depressed mom with a baby, it can be very hard for that baby to understand what's going on. So it can affect how we connect to that parent. Because if you're depressed, there's not much affect, right? For some moms, or they could be irritated or just angry more or more anxious. I mean, that can go with depression too. But that's what you're going to see. A baby is going to see that in the face, and we have mirror neurons. So you go, oh, there must be something alarming, or oh, I'm not important, like she's not smiling at me, or
Well,
however, yeah.
I was told that as an infant that I was like very sluggish, constantly sleeping, that I would
Oh,
have to be waken up to be fed a bottle. I don't think that I had a lot of
oh,
I don't think that I had a lot of time like being held and like
yeah,
comforted.
cuddled.
I think
Yeah.
I was kind of just laying down and sleeping and not really having those interactions. And I think that's why I struggled growing up as a child. I struggled with a lot of like a lot of learning
Hmm.
difficulties that went undiagnosed other than ADD.
Hmm.
I had a lot of sensorial issues and a lot of issues processing things, and I had like crippling social anxiety. I had an awkward gait, like I walked strange when
Hmm.
I was a young child. I had difficulty like distinguishing between my left and right, and
Hmm.
putting on my shoes and like buttoning and you
Fine motor
know
skills.
Yep.
Yeah.
I had a lot of difficulties, but I think back in the day, early intervention wasn't as gun-ho as it is now. And I think I kind of went under the
Pediatrician would have
radar.
noticed, yeah,
Yeah.
and said, "Oh, let's get you into in early intervention to see what's going on there, so you can get stimulated in those ways."
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think I received that stimulation as an infant and as a young child. And then at the age of 4, I was nonverbal. Like I was a verbal child, but because of circumstances in our home, we were forced to become nonverbal. And I was nonverbal for 2 years. And I think that really had a
Mm.
profound impact on me very negatively, like I felt very disconnected from others, very isolated, very disconnected even from myself. I
Hmm.
struggled a lot with emotional regulation. And growing up, I struggled with things like depression and suicide ideation and impulse control. Um, and now looking back, I can understand a lot of things about myself, but growing up, it was very confusing. And you know,
Hmm.
in the past, in the past, we were not told to express our feelings, and mental
Hmm.
health was something that was shunned and treated like in a shameful way instead of like a nat
Stigmatize.
yes. And there should
Hmm.
be no stigma because we all have brains, we all have feelings, and we need to learn how to process our emotions in a healthier way. And I think that's just therapy and talk therapy. I think that's just a human trying to take care of ourselves and
That's
try.
right. Yeah. Yeah, that's the basic part of, it's about surviving first and then starting to thrive. But if we don't have some of those, we can go back to them. You might have been choosing, like your brain chose, not to talk because whatever was going on, if it's
Well, I think
stressful
I was
enough, yeah,
willing to talk, but no one was willing to listen.
right. And then
Like
you stop talking.
people would say the things like, well, that's your mother, you need to love her and forgive her, and you only have one mother, or that's in the past, move on, you're a strong person. And like
Hmm.
I get that of moving forward and resiliency and not living in the
Sure, yeah.
you have to talk about your past and
Hmm.
acknowledge it and allow your body and your brain to process those emotions
What
because
you were getting
of
is
it.
they did not have what Sarah Payton calls a window of welcome for your emotions. So they didn't They didn't allow those. Those were not okay feelings, whatever they were. And in some homes, some feelings are okay, some feelings are not. And in some homes, they're like, well, they're all okay. Like that's just what we have.
I
There's
think it's so
cultural
important to
injunctions.
understand
Ooh.
that all emotions are okay, and
Oh,
we
they're a very big part of who we are. So we have feelings, right? We sense things in the world, or we think things, or we perceive something, and we have feelings about it. So we might have the fight or flight, the anxiety, anger kind of responses. But those are very much, they're kind of like a guy named Panksepp talks about that, but they're just ingrained and they're subcortical. Below, they just show up. Or if we're wanting to reach for something to meet some of our needs, but those things tend to be pushed away. And some of that could be like the enlightenment or the over focus on rationality. Because if we don't feel things, if we don't focus on that, they'll be poo-pooed like that's an emotion, that's not important. It's actually telling us a lot of information. If we're very upset, like I talk to clients and sometimes anger is an issue. How we express it is really the issue. But the reason for anger could be very important. The reason that I'm angry is because this thing didn't happen or this thing happened to me.
anger could be an underlying feeling of a lot of things like
Yeah,
grief,
yeah, yep,
sadness,
yep.
you
It
know,
can kind of coat it over.
heartbreak.
Yeah, it could be a combination of things. Yeah, sadness, disappointment, hurt, any of
Depression,
those.
even like sometimes
Yep.
depression symptoms can make you feel angry and like,
It's
you
one
know,
of the symptoms, yeah.
yeah.
Irritability can come along with sometimes depressed people are irritated.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, life doesn't feel okay. It's related to sadness. If we have a lot of sadness or grief, and then sometimes in our culture, we're encouraged, especially men, not to become violent physically, but it's more often encouraged. Women are discouraged in general. There's exceptions to this because, and it's changing, but there's usually feelings under those anger. There isn't always, sometimes anger is I can't reach this thing that I want and I have this need, but there's also sadness or guilt or shame when I work with clients. And then we start to go, and then that's because of this. And then what do you feel underneath that? Sometimes it's other things that I don't want to feel. And anger is an active feeling. So I do something to try to change whatever. The other feelings like depression is more like I don't, like we stop interacting or we go and we cry. It's more not passive, but it's not as outward to do something. So sometimes there can be that, but we think that we need to, and anger is tricky because we think we need to express it and call somebody a name and be enraged in our behavior. We can be enraged and still communicate in a way that's assertive and respectfully to others. It's just not easy. And the culture does not encourage it because we have a violent culture.
But we can
Violence is
practice
actually,
it, like we can
yeah.
mindfully
Yeah, you have to work at it.
because I used to live in yeah, rage and anger was a very familiar feeling for me.
Sure.
It was modeled to me so many times, and also because I think that because of unprocessed emotions, um,
Mm-hmm.
I internalized a lot of negative messages about myself and my self-worth and my identity, my self-identity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when I actually started sitting with my emotions and all my feelings, I realized that a lot of the rage and anger that I felt, the true underlying emotion was two different things, was sadness
Mm-hmm.
and grieving, like
Mm-hmm.
grieving the childhood that I should have had, grieving the regulated life that I should have had.
Hmm.
And I think that I lived in that state of anger for so long because it felt very familiar to my childhood of living in fear and constant
And you
hypervigilant
might have needed to
myself.
protect yourself. There may have been no room to feel sad or grief. You're more vulnerable if you're sad or grieving. You're behaving in those ways. And with a feeling, it's not just the emotion, it's also the physical sensations and an urge to act in a certain way. But those are more vulnerable. So there could have been a part of you that wanted to protect you. So it's more angry so you don't get hurt anymore.
And I think also because it was modeled to me, like the constant
Those people could have been doing the same thing because
arguing
they
back
weren't
and
being
forth,
vulnerable
like,
with each other. They were
yeah, like
arguing.
my mother and myself were we were like warriors at constant battle, constant nitpicking. I was constantly being attacked and I was constantly defending myself. And
Yep.
it was really hard for me because growing up, I kind of emulated that and brought that into relationships with other people,
Yeah.
you know, and
Well,
and
that's
it's
what
so
you
funny.
learn in close relationships. We learn how to interact from our family. And some of it we don't even think about anymore because it's just how we interact with people close to us. This is how we do it. Little kids, 4-year-olds, are not thinking, oh, I need to be protecting myself. Usually, I mean, there are exceptions. But in general, it's just this is how it feels to be in a relationship. And that's how we act. We don't think about it because that's what we experience because we didn't have words when we were really vulnerable and little, like when you weren't being held and cuddled and, being treated in a gentle, soothing way. So,
You know what's kind of crazy is that although I wasn't being held and coddled and all that, if you like anyone who really knows me as being super kind and empathic and
mhm,
loving and sympathetic to others and nurturing and like a fierce protector but loving and kind. Like
mhm,
I don't know, although I severely lacked that. I understood what I severely lacked because I would observe those traits in other people and I would read about it in books.
mhm.
So could you explain that to me? Like, I don't know, because like usually people are a negative product of their environment, and I
They
feel like
can be.
some of those things that should have
Yeah.
been my weakest, I think are my actual strengths.
Well, yeah, and I'm gonna have to get going here in a minute or two. But yeah, some of it is the, you could have been, like, some people would say that that's our nature. A lot of people said that's not our nature. I mean, even religious people, well, we're sinners. Yeah, but also God created us in a certain way. And if you see that when people are really contributing and caring, you see that in like Gaza, places like that. They're actually staying and tolerating and being kind to one another. I don't always know their motives, but I go, gosh, I don't know. I just want to get the heck
Despite
away
all
from
the
all of this.
trauma, despite all the
Despite being shot at and bombed, and they're like helping each other, they're at risk all the time, but they're not just protecting their own thing, they're helping one another. Not
I
everyone
think
for
the
sure,
driver
but
of humanity is love. The thread that
right,
keeps us all
right.
together is love, and we want to be connected with ourselves and with nature and with each other. And I think that regardless of what traumatic experiences people might endure in their lifetime, that it's up to the individual to strive to be the best human that we can be despite all the struggles.
Right, and you can be. There's a guy who has studies antisocial personality, does brain scans. He did his own brain scan. He realized his brain was similar, like their brain structures apparently were different in some ways. So, but he said, why am I nurturing and studying this? Why didn't I have a lot of those traits? Because it's not genetically, there's a combination of things there. He was also raised, he was adopted, and his parents were apparently very nurturing. So he learned it from that. You might have learned it from books or others. You know, if you had teachers or neighbors or an uncle or an aunt or somebody in the neighborhood, you know, they give you cookies and they ask you how you are, or they treat you nicely at the store. You know,
I
they'll
noticed
be,
those
yeah,
things. I noticed those things, and it definitely was noticeable, and it
yeah,
definitely made an impact.
yeah. And those things could have made a real impact because you noticed it and it cared for you and you needed that. And they might have been your nurturing self. So it helped you to grow up and to develop them. So, yeah.
Well, Max, I want to thank you for your time today. I know you have a session coming up with a therapy client, but I want to thank you for taking time to talk about these things with me, and
Sure. Sounds
we'll be talking.
exciting for you.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
we'll be talking soon about, BIPOC community issues and incarceration issues. So make sure to stay tuned with June and Max, and we appreciate y'all's time.
Okay.
Bye,
Thanks.
Max. Take care. Have a
Bye.
good
You
day.
too. You
Bye.
too. Take care. Bye.